Hi, I'm Logan, one of the managers of MCAT content and curriculum here at Kaplan. In this video, Kevin Anderson, one of our expert MCAT instructors, will show you how he breaks down one of the toughest passages in the Bio-Biochem section of Kaplan's free MCAT practice test. These questions were written by Kaplan's question writers and validated by Kaplan's psychometrics team to be as representative of the real MCAT as possible, so you know you're getting a great representation of what you will actually see on test day. This passage focuses on diabetes, with questions requiring knowledge of enzyme kinetics, renal physiology, research design, and blood. Follow along to see how Kevin attacks this passage using Kaplan's passage and question strategies.
Before I jump into reading the newest challenge that the MCAT dropped into my lap, I start with a quick preview. What exactly am I looking at, and will this be something that I breeze through, or something that has me questioning everything I thought I knew? Luckily, I don't have to search too far before I find the answer to these questions. The passage is obviously about diabetes, and the table in the upcoming paragraphs shows me that some sort of experiment was done to treat this condition. Now, with experience, you'll start to recognize patterns in how these passages are written. This one particularly falls under the pattern of disease, description, treatment. Passages like this usually have questions on the cause-effect of the pathology, the mechanism of action for any of the proposed treatments, or how the intervention works, and then some reasoning about the findings or the table that is shown here. An outline or interrogation method will work most appropriate here, and I'll use the interrogation approach due to that small experiment at the end in the final paragraph. With that in mind, read with a predictive mindset and look for testable information as you continue to read. The first sentence is mostly background info and simply introduces the topic of diabetes, something that the AAMC absolutely expects you to know about before test day. The second sentence hints at potential reasoning questions. It mentions a mechanism and calls out that glucose transporters have become saturated. The result is that glucose can no longer be reabsorbed and instead is excreted in the urine. Now, I highlighted this to draw attention to the mechanism here. The sentence also primes me for some enzyme kinematics questions or a potential target for treatment, since this is something that differs in diabetic versus healthy patients. Lastly, there's mention of glucose reacting with hemoglobin. Now, the AAMC doesn't like to leave cliffhangers at the end of a paragraph, so if I'm reading with a predictive mindset, I'm expecting that they'll expand upon this in the coming paragraphs. Glucose can bind to hemoglobin, which creates an A1C variant. This A1C is measured to assess the average blood glucose levels over the past 60 days. This kind of indirect measurement is pretty common in science. Oftentimes, the thing of interest cannot be directly measured, so we measure something that correlates with it. Naturally, a higher A1C means higher average blood glucose over those 60 days, which in turn means that the person isn't managing their condition as well and might suffer more severe symptoms and complications as a result. This logic's pretty straightforward, but where questions may arise is from the numbers associated with normal and high values, as indicated here in the paragraph. Another important thing to note is that uncontrolled diabetes can lead to kidney disease. Relate this back to the previous paragraph, which mentioned that the glucose transporters in the kidneys become saturated and can no longer accommodate the amount of glucose in the blood. This is likely one of the causes of kidney disease in poorly managed diabetes. The final sentence follows up with another factor relating to mismanaged diabetes, albuminuria, which only happens in patients with abnormal kidney function. In other words, detecting plasma albumin in the urine is a measure of kidney disease, with higher amounts likely indicating more severe disease. Overall, this paragraph has given me two ways to measure the severity of diabetes: higher levels of A1C and albuminuria. The last paragraph focuses on the treatment, and like all treatment studies, it makes sense that we're measuring the effect of the treatment on the symptoms with the intent of reducing or completely removing symptoms from the patient. The next part breaks down the experiment details, though once you progress in your studies, this type of experiment should become apparent at a glance. If you want to test how well an intervention performs, you have two groups of diabetic patients. One group gets the new intervention, the other is the control. Measure the symptoms, whether through direct or indirect means, and then compare the results. The hope is that the treatment group performs better than the control group. Here, the control receives the standard treatment, simply because it would be unethical to ignore patient treatment and then just give them a full placebo. The researchers then measure the two groups for the presence, disappearance, or emergence of albuminuria, which was already stated as an indicator of kidney disease. Turning to the table, I want to first assess what the variables are that are being measured, even though they've been covered in the text. Next, I'll attempt to recognize any trends that might appear, as well as what conclusions can be drawn. This doesn't need to be an elaborate process, and I'm not trying to write a dissertation on the research, but simply noticing that X leads to Y is going to be sufficient. The results show pre- and post-test measurements in relation to albuminuria, which again is a measure of kidney disease. Each group was similar at the start, but the intensive treatment group showed more patients recovered from their pre-treatment albuminuria, and less patients developed albuminuria over the course of treatment. Overall, I'd say this is a win for the intensive group. Now, with a solid understanding of the passage behind us, it's time to attack the questions. I mentioned during the read step that I was primed for an enzyme kinematics question, and here we see a question about enzyme kinematics. However, oxygen hemoglobin binding was not mentioned in the passage, so this is a discrete type question. I also want to take a moment to rephrase this question. Even if it may seem straightforward, taking a moment to rephrase gives you a better understanding and helps avoid selecting a tempting wrong answer choice. If oxygen hemoglobin does not follow Michaelis-Menten kinetics, then it must be due to a unique characteristic of this, and since this isn't in the passage, it's something I'll have to rely on my background info. A solid rephrase for this could be, what is unique about oxygen and hemoglobin binding? Any discussion of oxygen and hemoglobin would be incomplete without mentioning the cooperative binding effects that they exhibit, in which the binding of oxygen to one of the 4 active sites on hemoglobin induces a conformational change that increases the affinity for oxygen at the other 3 active sites. Now, when a ligand binds to one place on a protein, and it has an effect at another site, it's a form of allosteric regulation. Typically, we talk about allosteric regulation as an allosteric inhibitor, but in this case, it's actually having a positive effect. With that prediction in mind, it's easy to jump right to the answer, but during review, taking the time to understand the wrong answers can be just as valuable. A is true, which most likely is what makes it tempting. Hemoglobin is a carrier protein. It transports oxygen to tissues in need. But just because something is true doesn't make it correct, and saying what the protein does not say anything about the kinetics. And for B, hemoglobin's strong affinity to carbon monoxide is what makes carbon monoxide poisoning very dangerous, but that doesn't impact the Michaelis-Menten graph for hemoglobin and oxygen, so an answer like this is going to be out of scope. C mentions allosteric effects, and while it might not be worded in an exact way that we predicted, it does reference the cooperative binding through allosteric regulation of oxygen to one of the other 4 active sites. Lastly, D is also true. Oxygen is a gas at STP. But keep in mind, the hemoglobin doesn't react with oxygen at STP, it reacts with oxygen inside your body. Again, just because a statement is true does not mean that it is going to correctly answer the question at hand. Now, a quick glance at the answer choices here shows me we'll need to do some math. And this also tells me to be careful of any easy mistakes I can make, like using the wrong numbers or putting them in the wrong order, since those tend to be the most common wrong answer choices. The question is clearly pointing to the results table at the end of the passage. It can be tempting to look at the final column and think 1480 is the answer, and this is a common trap on the MCAT. Most questions that ask for some form of calculation or number manipulation are going to have a wrong answer that's cleverly disguised as a number that you would get if you did the math incorrectly or if you only did part of the math that was required. Now, 1480 accounts for the patients that developed albuminuria, but it neglects the patients that had albuminuria to start with. Adding these two numbers gives us 3,103, the second trap answer. We also need to subtract the 922 patients whose albuminuria resolved throughout the course of treatment. So the math is shown on the right-hand side of the screen here, but there's no need to get out the scratch paper and start working through this calculation. This is a simple enough calculation to do, but the answers are far enough apart to do some very rough estimates here. Essentially, we have 1,500 plus 1,600 gives us about 3,100, minus 1,000 gives us roughly 2,100 patients. This matches B. Question 23 is another pseudo-discrete question, and one that drops a few hints at the answer. It defines polyuria as an increase in urine, which is composed of mostly water. It then says that more glucose in the renal tubule directly causes a decrease in what? The word directly is italicized as the hint here. How does an increase in glucose lead to an increase in fluid or an increase in urine? The beginning of the passage said that at high blood glucose levels, glucose begins to appear in the urine. In other words, there are more solutes in the urine. How can this directly affect fluid volume? This has me thinking of osmolarity, where the glucose leads to an increase in the osmotic pressure in the urine, which would then draw water towards it. Now to find an answer that matches this prediction. Aquaporins do not open or close as a direct result of glucose in the renal tubule, and this wouldn't affect sodium reabsorption either, so A and B are out. C and D differ by only a single word, so that's cause to slow down and ensure that you pick the correct one. This question says that glucose causes a decrease in something, which leads to more fluid in the urine. This is where background knowledge of the kidney really helps out. The thick ascending limb is impermeable to water. I remember this because it's so thick that the water can't get through it. This is the site of ion reabsorption in the loop of Henle. Since water doesn't move through the ascending limb at all, C is going to be incorrect. The thin descending limb is what's responsible for water reabsorption. If this was decreased, more water would be excreted as urine, making D our correct answer choice. Question 24 is reminiscent of a psych-soc topic on ethics, and in fact, that's what this question is really asking about. There was no control group that received only a placebo. It was instead a group that received standard treatment and a group that received the new intensive treatment with different drugs and dosages. Essentially, this boils down to an issue of ethics. We have many different treatments for diabetes. To knowingly withhold treatment from a patient who believes that they are receiving care would be entirely unacceptable. Instead, when a new intervention is brought to market, it is compared against the current gold standard of treatment, whether that is a medication, a therapy, a surgery, or some combination of those. So with that in mind, let's look for an answer that matches. A is just simply not true. There was more than enough patients to split into another group, and even if this were true, this is not an acceptable reason to omit a placebo control. B is also not true. A double-blind study still follows the same rules. There should be a control group that omits the independent variable. C could be argued as opposite. Adding a placebo group would show the effect of the intervention more clearly. And that leads us to the correct answer, which would be D. Not treating someone with a treatable condition is a risk that is just not worth taking.